From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Lou Rieger, and I'm the Special Assistant to the Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs, under which we have the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Kluge Fellow Victor Goldgel-Carballo. It is entitled The Quest for the New in Latin American Culture, Fashion and Newspapers in the 19th Century. Victor's lecture focuses on early 19th century debates concerning the acceleration of cultural change and on emerging forms of discursive authority. Now, before we begin, I want to give you the usual reminder to turn off your cell phones or put them on mute so nobody's disturbed in the course of the lecture. And also remind you that the center is a great gift of the philanthropist Dr. or Mr. John W. Kluge, who's given a number of wonderful gifts to the Library of Congress. And we hope to continue his legacy by creating a scholarly venue here on Capitol Hill where some of the world's finest scholars and thinkers gather both to use the library's collection and to enhance each other's work. And also, we hope to bring wisdom to the nation's leaders. The center supports a wide range of public programs, such as the lecture that you're about to hear today. And I invite you to sign up after for automatic RSS feeds that'll keep you more informed about our upcoming events. And do we have brochures today? We often do. They're in the back there. So feel free to pick those up on your way out. Send them to family, friends. Let as many people know about us as you would like. With all that said, I'd like to tell you a little more about our speaker. Dr. Victor Goldgel-Carballo is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin, in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in now that's where I lost my place on my, in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He received his PhD, in Hispanic languages and literature, and completed his undergraduate work at the Universidad de Buenos Aires. Victor has won multiple fellowships besides his Kluge Fellowship, including one from the Social Sciences Research Council International, and his publications are in a variety of journals, including Media History and Teatro 21. Victor Goldgel is here to tell you about the project that he undertook at the Kluge Center, a project which one of his reviewers entitled Sophisticated, Cogent, and Extremely Original. Please help me welcome him today, Dr. Victor Goldgel-Carballo. And I apologize for getting Portuguese and Spanish.
Mixed. Do you need this? Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank the Kluge Center in particular for their hospitality, Mary Lou, Travis, Deirdre, Caroline, everybody really. And it's been a privilege for me to spend almost 6 months now at the library with its wonderful collections, and this has helped me to complete the project I was here for, which is a book project that I will be talking about today, but it has also helped me begin new lines of inquiry, so I'm very grateful for that as well. And today I will be talking about the quest for the new in Latin America. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a book. And I'll tell you a little bit about the conceptual framework of the book, because I hope that will make my presentation more engaging for those who are not familiar with early 19th century Latin America. but I will, of course, also offer you some glimpses of the kind of materials that I have found in the library and of the particular historical contexts that I work on. And before I define more clearly the boundaries of my objects of study, I would like to say that what has fueled this project from the very beginning is my personal curiosity to understand our modern fascination with the new. And that's why I really appreciate that an evaluator said my work is deeply original. And I immediately try to think, well, what does that really mean, that I'm being original? And as you know, whether you are in academia, in journalism, or in the world of advertising, there seems to be a very effective way of assigning value to a given work, which is to point out that it is new. If you're sending an article to a journal or submitting a book for proposal, for example, it is imperative that you explain what makes your work new. But the new did not always have the same value. Being original was not always something to be proud of, for example. Young artists or scholars did not always have that aura which gives their lack of accomplishments an air of promise. And far from being an imperative, in many contexts and periods of history, to say something new was equivalent to being wrong. The main purpose behind my book has been precisely to follow this trajectory of the new as a criterion of value in a particular context, which is basically the first half of the 19th century in Latin America. When does it start to be possible, for example, to claim that a certain book should not be read anymore because it is already old? This said in the library doesn't make a lot of sense, but my daily work is very marked by this philosophy of books getting old and then disposable very quickly, and scholars trying to just keep reading the cutting-edge stuff. And where does the power of fashions stem from? Under what conditions does being up-to-date become a fundamental proof of one's symbolic capital? So focusing on the first half of the 19th century, I analyze the cultural shift by which the new acquired an increased presence and legitimacy in cultural discourse in the context of profound political, economic, and social transformations in Latin America. I analyze, for example, how the concept of the new moves away from its negative meaning of puzzlement or disruption. And I do this by studying select periodicals published throughout a period of about 70 years, from 1790 to 1860, more or less, and by comparing colonial and post-colonial contexts that experienced particularly rapid processes of modernization. More specifically, Cuba, that would remain a colony until almost the 20th century, and two regions that embarked in processes of political emancipation, namely Chile and the Rio de la Plata, which, for the sake of clarity, I will just call Argentina. So Cuba, Chile, and Argentina, in a way, are my main areas of research. And why this comparison? Why Cuba, a colony, and these post-colonial regions? On the one hand, I should point out what all of these regions had in common. The rapid economic growth that I just mentioned, and the fact that they belonged to what one may call the periphery of colonial Spanish America. Compared to Mexico or Peru, which were political and economic centers within the colony, these regions inherited what was perceived as a very weak cultural tradition. Their Creole elites perceived themselves as living in nations with almost no past, and this, of course, had a direct effect on the way in which they related to the new. On the other hand, I should say that by comparing Chile and Argentina with the colonial context, Cuba, I wanted to test some of the claims of the nationalistic discourses that emerged in the new republics, and which posit an understanding of modern culture and history centered around the break with the Hispanic tradition, right? In this sense, my analysis departs from the nation-building paradigms that have governed studies of the Latin American 19th century, and a good example for those of you familiar with this bibliography would be Doris Summers' Foundational Fictions from 1993. And my work establishes instead a dialogue among texts of a wider region, wider than the nation state, and I'll try to include some networks of cultural exchange that were transatlantic in nature. And the book has 3 sections: periodicals, fashion, and literary debates. But for the sake of time, I will focus on the first 2 today. I will briefly mention the third one, though. Periodicals, let me define those objects for you. I understand periodicals as new media, and I will talk about this a little bit more soon. I understand fashion as a social mechanism that operates a rapid renewal of objects and practices. And then I will talk very briefly about the literary debates in which I trace how the Enlightenment-inspired cultural discourse of the late 18th century extends and intersects with the Romantic movement that that in Latin America begins in the 1830s. In periodicals, in fashion, and in the Enlightenment Romantic discourse, we find comparable efforts to grant legitimacy on the basis of newness, and also to transform the new into an object of inquiry. So let's begin with periodicals. And since I'm at the library, I think I should say that by periodicals, I simply understand newspapers and magazines appearing at regular intervals. Anything that is published periodically is a periodical in this context, including newspapers, daily newspapers. That's the way the word periódicos was used in Spanish back in the day. The first section, periodicals, analyzes the boom of periodicals that occurred during the first half of the 19th century in Latin America, focusing on those edited in Buenos Aires, Santiago de Chile, and Havana. These publications, which I consulted here at the library, as well as in the archives of those 3 cities, are my main corpus, and I also refer to them in the other sections of the book. But here, in this section, I pay special attention to their materiality and to the media ecology in which they were published. Let me emphasize that periodicals started to proliferate in Latin America at the beginning of the 19th century, in the context of the wars of independence that took place around 1810 and 1825, more or less. So up until 1810, only 45 periodicals had been published throughout the whole continent, throughout history, only 45. However, another 500 would see the light in the brief period between 1810 and 1830. And in many regions, such as the Rio de la Plata, Chile, and Venezuela, the first would appear only during the first years of the 19th century. For example, to the left you see Santiago, that the first newspaper, the first periodical, not daily newspaper, was from 1812. Havana, 1864, although the main important one is from 1790, sorry. Rio de Janeiro, 1808, Montevideo, 1807, Buenos Aires, 1801. So for those of you working on, I don't know, English culture, French culture, even American culture, this seems pretty late, right, compared to the printing press in other areas of the world. So when we take the continent as a whole, it is arguably during the first half of the 19th century that the periodical press effectively emerges in Latin America. In the book, I discuss some of the reasons why it might be critically productive to use the category of new medium to frame these periodicals. And as you know, the rupturistic and properly modern claims of digital new media gurus that marked the last 2 decades have also been matched by a growing bibliography on the history of new media, which aims at putting present-day forms in dialogue with older ones. And one of the things that we can learn from this bibliographical corpus is that the link between media and the trope of newness was certainly not born with digital technologies. In the case of Latin America, the history of this link can be traced back, for example, to the boom of periodicals of the early 19th century. Of course, you might also say that all media were once new, right? But I would respond that these early 19th century periodicals were a new medium in a more specifically modern sense. And I would say so because they were perceived as valuable not only because they were useful, but also if I may put it in this simple way, because they were something new. In the context of the rise of a type of historical consciousness that privileged expectations over experience, which is how Reinhard Koselleck has defined modernity. The growing importance of expectations over experience, over the past that is inherited. From this perspective, these Latin American periodicals were a new medium inasmuch as their claims to break with the past overrode their claims to continue a specific cultural tradition. And what I do throughout this part of the book is to show how, whereas during the late 18th century, the discourse of the Enlightenment had given unprecedented legitimacy to the new in its quest for the rational and the useful, the high-speed Enlightenment characteristic of 19th century periodicals intensified its process to the point that the new could become autonomous, or an autonomous source of cultural values. In a similar way, with the boom of periodicals that occurred during the early 19th century, the Enlightenment era assumption that this new medium simply served to disseminate knowledge gave way to a more complex vision. As the first decades of the 19th century went by, Latin American writers started noticing the effects that the new medium had on modes of reading and writing, and vice versa. The emergence of this new medium was in fact inseparable from the emergence of new forms of prose, which were described as accelerated, for example. And one of the things I argue in the book is that the debates on the accelerated prose of periodicals, a prose characterized by variety, shortness, and accessibility, laid the foundation for later debates on literary genres such as the novel. And this is important for my project because as a literary scholar I was trained to think that national literatures, and especially the novel, emerged ex nihilo or as simple imitations of European models. And focusing on media history allowed me to avoid this modern nationalistic myth of rupture with the past, while at the same time transforming this myth into an object of study. So one of the things that I point out is that the debates around the novel and its link to modern times were in a sense the aftermath of the boom of periodicals that occurred during the first decades of the century. And more broadly, I argue that many of the debates on national literature's characteristic of what would be known as the Romantic period from 1830 to 1860, more or less, had been actually taking place decades earlier as debates on a new medium, that is, debates on the possibilities and the dangers opened up in the lettered city by periodicals. As I mentioned, one of the processes I analyze has to do with the move towards brevity and variety in the page of periodicals, a move that is visually evident when one compares publications from around 1800 to others that were made 3 or 4 decades later. And very quickly, I will show you, for example, this publication from 1802 from Buenos Aires, a semanario that was published weekly. As you can see, it begins with an article called Agricultura that goes on in page 2 and page 3, and then goes on in page 4, and page 5, and then in page 6 and page 7. And then it ends in page 8, that's the last page of the periodical. They were very short, and in some cases, several issues would continue publishing the same article. So you have this homogeneity, this visual homogeneity, right? And if you go towards the middle of the century, you start having periodicals such as El Correo Literario from Chile that are actually based on the idea of variety, brevity, and I wish I had more time to show you how it looked inside. This is simply, the cover to catch the attention of readers, but you can imagine the inside because it's a lot more similar to what we're used to looking at when we open a magazine nowadays. Well, when I open a magazine nowadays, I really have a hard time. I don't know where the table of content is. I don't know what's an article and what's an ad. It's very confusing. Maybe these people have the same experience. Like, what is this? So anyway, as the 19th century went on, of course, this trend became more and more pressing. In 1860, for example, the Chilean journalist Julio Arteaga Lemparte described it as follows. And he writes, "There is hunger for the new. We get tired today of the things that pleased us yesterday. Tomorrow we will reject with scorn what entertains us, enchants us, and maybe makes us happy today. The newspaper, the diario, published every day, is in the best position to obey this tendency. Only the newspaper can satisfy this persistent and prevailing need." And I think the last two sentences seem extremely dated now, right? The newspaper is in the best position to obey this tendency. Only the newspaper can satisfy this persistent and prevailing need. With the emergence of the radio, television, or Twitter, the printed newspaper has progressively lost much of its privileged intimacy with the new, right? During the 19th century, however, Latin American writers understood periodicals as the most effective means to satisfy the desire for constant renovation that increasingly marked cultural life in the region. In their view, periodicals were not only a new medium, but also a medium with which to satiate that hunger for the new observed by Arteaga and Lemparte. Latin American periodicals seem to derive a great part of their value from the speed with which they could reproduce and put knowledge, opinions, and data in circulation. So rather than simple containers of information, they were understood as a symptom of an acceleration in the tempo of culture in general. The same Arteaga Lemparte wrote, "When you travel by steam, you also need to think by steam." And by steam, he meant fast. I know this doesn't make a lot of sense nowadays either, but faster times, he observed, require faster media. And precisely because they were faster and therefore seemed to mediate better, periodicals were considered more modern. That is more appropriate to present times than previous media, such as books. And a lot of people predicted that books would quickly disappear because with periodical, why would you even need books? You're probably more familiar with the work of Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, an Argentine writer who had an active career as a journalist during his exile in Chile in the 1840s, and who is famous because of his rapidly canonized Facundo, or Civilización y Barbarie, Civilization and Barbarism, which first appeared as a feuilleton in a Chilean newspaper, that is, as a serialized publication. Sarmiento, as many writers of his era, was actively involved in editing periodicals. In 1841, he wrote an article entitled El Diarismo, or Newspaper Journalism, in which he observed the following. "The newspaper embodies present-day societies, and it can be said that their literature, languages, and eloquence suffer from the shortness, superficiality, and circumstantial character of newspapers. In antiquity, the life of a sage was barely enough to produce a book. Today, a few hours suffice to send the article to the press." And new media, from the newspaper to the internet, have been repeatedly attributed this power to mark the emergence of a new time. In the case of Sarmiento, that present time of periodicals that seem to be radically removed from the past time of books, for example. And in this new present, Sarmiento writes, "The acceleration of cultural production makes all writing, no matter how brilliant, die with the day." There are, of course, nostalgic overtones in this type of comments, but I would like to emphasize that Sarmiento's main goal in this article is simply to describe what he perceived as the current conditions for the production of texts and knowledge, conditions that include the emergence of new forms of discursive authority, such as the ability to be up to date. Under these conditions, the fleeting, the transient, and the new, in that sense, stopped being negative attributes and acquired an unprecedented cultural value. Now, before we move on to fashion, let me just add that if many writers face the increasing importance of brevity and speed with enthusiasm, others reacted with skepticism and caution. And if you work on other periods of history, you will have heard of these debates. In some cases, there was a sense of alarm caused by periodicals that went as far as to compromise the printing press itself, which, at least until the arrival of railroads, was probably the most glorified technology in Latin America. In 1836, for example, an anonymous writer from Montevideo pointed out the following paradox. Although Gutenberg's machine put all kinds of knowledge in circulation, it also made this knowledge volatile, which is, again, very ironic when I say this here, right, that Gutenberg made something volatile. This extremely useful invention, he wrote, this journalist from Montevideo, this extremely useful invention has produced astonishing effects, but in a superficial way. It teaches us how to know, but not how to think. You do not know more than what you read, and you even forget that knowledge later because it did not require work to learn it. It was too easy to acquire, then you forget it very easily. So the opportunity to read and write was increasingly present, but that proximity seemed to put traditional forms of knowledge in crisis. And I think it is worth noticing that these sorts of arguments were not born with periodicals and will most likely not end with digitization, right? By breathing new life into the printing presses of the continent, 19th century periodicals also spawned critiques that had been directed towards print and writing in previous moments of history. Plato's attack on writing in the Phaedrus, for example, and the 15th and 16th century laments over the dire effects that the printing press would have on memory and wisdom would therefore be resuscitated in early 19th century Latin America by the boom of periodicals. But let's move to fashion because we don't have a lot of time really. Fashion is the second section of my book, as I mentioned, and this second section of the book focuses on fashion understood as a social force of continuous renewal, which affects not only the realm of clothing and but also many others. Right? Fashion could be fashion of everything, really, any realm of daily life. In particular, I'm interested in seeing how fashion imposes its own logic on literature. In other words, how literature starts being ruled by the logic of continuous renewal, making it possible to state, for example, that the flow of time reduces the value of a given work or a given writer. I don't argue, of course, that the preference for the new, and in that sense for renewal, did not exist in previous moments of history. Rather, I simply show how during the first half of the 19th century, this preference acquires a greater legitimacy in cultural discourse in the Hispanic world. It is this greater legitimacy, for example, what allows a Chilean newspaper to observe that the work of the famous Argentine poet Esteban Echeverría, the most famous poet of the time, had lost most of its value in just a few years. The underlying reason of this, a reason widely proclaimed during the Romantic period, was that literature is an expression of society. And as a given society changes, so its literature must change. You might be familiar with the idea of the spirit of the age, the Zeitgeist. In Spanish, this was known as the espíritu del siglo, but also as moda, or fashion. Beginning in the 1830s, fashion is often written with a capital letter, like progress. It was a force shaping the present. And literature, therefore, was supposed to follow fashion. Everything was supposed to follow fashion for these writers of the 1830s and 1840s in particular. But the link between fashion and literature, which is particularly clear beginning in the 1830s, is just the point of arrival of this section. What I do in the book is to step back a little bit and study the importance of fashion before that and in other realms. And here's an example of the kinds of things that I found out by expanding my corpus to include periodicals of a large span in time. Fashion columns, for example, only begin appearing in the 1830s and the 1840s. Before that, and during the 18th century for sure, fashion only appeared in periodicals as an object of mockery and as something that should be morally censored. it was certainly still very far from becoming synonymous with progress. There is one figure in particular in which the satires against fashion are articulated, the fop. I think that's the most useful translation into English, or the petimetre in Spanish. The young man who shows an excessive inclination towards clothing and other signs of distinction. And there is probably no other social type that received more satirical attacks in the periodicals of the era. And he received several names. Among the nouns, lechuguino, fashionable, petimetre, currutaco, león, modista, paquete, catrín, facenda, faceto, paterato, ciutico. Every region had its own name and found out this social type, and they all felt that that was something uniquely Chilean, right, or uniquely Peruvian, or uniquely, and then when you read bibliography from other areas of the world, it's the same. You know, the fop is very different from the dandy, of course, and the dandy is not exactly the same as the petimetre that was going on in Spain at the same time. Anyway, it's very interesting how people appropriate these figures as something very national and very local. In the period that I study, the fop is the first subject who performs the public show of innovation for the sake of innovation, right? And that's pretty shocking to people back then. It is not surprising then that he was attacked with some of the same words that will be later used to attack fashion: frivolous, ridiculous, shocking, for example. And let me show you another satire of fashionable subjects that has to do with this big comb called peineton. The ladies are wearing peinetones. This was in fashion in Buenos Aires in the 1830s. Of course, it was new. It was shocking. It was different, like many fashions, right? It's supposed to be shocking. And for many scholars, this implies an effort of women to occupy more space in the public sphere. As you can I think that's too literal of an explanation of what was going on. You could also argue, I mean, there are several interpretations. I don't have to really expand on this. But as you can see, there were several, these are lithographs that were published in 1834. I have this book in my office. I should have brought it. This is called Peinetones en Casa, and then there is one more, Peinetones en el Paseo. So, like the corset, these peinetones were perceived as signs of the tyranny of fashion, right? In a way that the fashion limited the freedom of their subjects, right? They could even, lose control of their own bodies. Their body, they could get hurt. They could fly in unexpected directions. It was a dangerous thing to involve in fashion from a certain perspective. But there were, of course, also signs of distinction, right? Things like the corset or the peinetones were only worn by people who didn't really have to work and had a lot of time to get dressed like that. And it was also a sign of distinction for the husbands, who used women as, in a way, sumptuary exhibits of their own wealth, whereas male fashion tended to be more austere after the French Revolution. So, going back to the fop, what seemed to render the fop particularly problematic in the eyes of his critics was his insatiable desire for new things. But as I point out in the book, it is interesting to note that the satires of the fop were contemporary with a number of Enlightenment-inspired periodicals that were trying to infuse or stimulate a desire for new things in their societies, with the idea that consumption would not only fuel the economy, but also serve as a moralizing force. And it is also indispensable to consider the changes in trade and patterns of consumption that occurred during the first decades of the 19th century in Latin America. The fall of the Spanish monopoly and the expansion of Cuban, Chilean, and Argentine economies contributed to the emergence of novel patterns of consumption. And ultimately, paved the way for a new consideration of fashion. Since I don't have time to dwell on these changes in the material culture of the time, I will just share with you the opinion of Mariquita Sanchez, an Argentine writer whose family was among the most prominent in the elite. Towards the 1860s, and writing about life in the city of Buenos Aires prior to 1810, Mariquita Sanchez points out that when she was a child, women only wore dresses made out of cheap fabric because those were the only fabrics available. She mentions that whenever a window broke, it had to be covered with paper. And she even says that the viceroy had to borrow china from the neighbors whenever he entertained a large number of people. He didn't have enough china in his own home. But in addition to scarcity, Mariquita emphasized the importance of austerity, observing that the richest families of Argentina considered that not spending any money was the most natural thing on earth. As you can imagine, this contrasts with the subjective disposition towards consumption that characterizes later decades, the kind of disposition that deems fashion a normal and legitimate social mechanism of continuous renewal, right? In fact, from the 1830s onwards, fashion begins to be publicly defended as a civilizing force. There are a number of periodicals that begin to use the word fashion in their names, and in these periodicals, you can find a number of arguments to prove the civilizing qualities of this social force, fashion. Among those many arguments, there is one that I mentioned earlier. Fashion is an expression of society. Fashion is the manifestation of the spirit of the age. And let me share a quote with you from El Iniciador, a periodical published in 1838 in Montevideo. In addition to believing that there is nothing useless in society, nothing is useless in society, we think that fashion is the principal and most active agent of progress. There is no such thing as backward fashion. Through the fashions of a people, one can learn the movement of its spirit. In the same paragraph in which we read that fashion expresses the spirit of a nation, we can also read that fashion is the agent that keeps the nation moving forward. So what do we do with this paradox, right? Fashion expresses a spirit, and fashion is what is the force that moves that nation forward, that shapes that spirit. Once again, I wish I had more time to develop this, but let me just say that the young writers in charge of this periodical made an attempt to use fashion to transform that society in which it was of which it was an expression. And these writers believed that the laws and constitutions that followed the declarations of independence had proven insufficient to make the new republics work, and that Latin Americans were still living as in the times of the old regime. They believed in the need to bring revolution into all aspects of social life, not only political institutions, and in that sense, their main objective was to transform the customs and behaviors that were prevalent among the readers. The fashions they prefer, in hats, in hairdos, in clothing, are always described as elegant but simple, as distinguished but egalitarian, for example, right? So, of course, there were debates among what fashions were legitimate for the new republic, right? Now, there were also a number of critiques addressed to fashion and fashion followers. Fashion, for example, almost always meant French or English fashion, which motivated heated debates on the meaning of progress and its links with the local. And fashion was a force that would help Spanish America to break with the Hispanic past. But there were also times in which it was rather thought of as a good example of the fetishization of the new, of an alienated type of behavior that transformed subjects into automatons. In this sense, one could say that fashion became a site for the articulation of some of the earliest critiques of modernity in the region. Since we don't have a lot of time, I will briefly refer to the last section of my book, in which you can see some of the implications of my study of periodicals and fashion in tandem with the literary culture of the early 19th century new republics of Latin America and Cuba. So the final and shortest part of my talk, and I'm really like about to end very soon. For the sake of clarity, instead of explaining what the third part of the book looks like, I will simply refer to a couple of aspects, right? And aspects that I think relate to media and fashion in several ways. I mentioned earlier that in order for fashion to emerge as an important social force, Latin American societies had first to go through a transformation in their relationship to the international market and in their subjective disposition towards consumption. In this respect, I also mentioned the efforts of many Enlightenment-inspired periodicals to create or stimulate a desire for new things in their societies. This third section of my book helps me to elaborate on that because it analyzes this stimulation in more detail. It analyzes the way in which writers conceived of the stimulating quality of literature, a quality that served to interrupt the lethargy in which Latin American societies were supposedly stuck. Right? Lethargy was associated with the colonial past, and the populations had to be stimulated in different ways to wake up, right? To wake up to modernity. And what I argue is that in many texts, the new is a central component of this ability to stimulate, move, or produce enthusiasm. Or if we want to see this under a different light, the ability to rhetorically coerce. There is a question, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that summarizes this coercion. How is it possible, this is the question, how is it possible that there are still some people who believe X or who believe Y? If I was particularly fascinated by the rhetorical maneuver operated through this question when I began perceiving it in the archive, it's probably because we still believe in its power, a modern power seemingly inexhaustible. Think, for example, of our honest strategies to justify our scholarship in the case of researchers like me. For a long time, we usually say scholars have been doing X. But in recent years, at last, the whatever turn, the spatial turn, the national turn, the political turn, has made us understand the importance of doing Y, right? And in private, we are more blunt and we say things such as such and such scholar still believes that Homi Bhabha is cutting edge, or look, that department, they still think that deconstruction is something new, etc., etc. In the book, I study how the at last rhetoric, as I call it, a rhetoric that moves truth and reason away from the past and into the future, prepares the literary terrain for a type of newness that is more or less self-sufficient. I studied this rhetoric in the writings of the late 18th century, but I also show that these writings and those of the Romantic period that begins around 1830 reveal surprising continuity, a continuity that consists of a sustained effort to see the world anew, to show what had always been there but had never been seen. So I mentioned earlier that the prevalence of European fashions during the 1830s and 1840s was matched by growing interest in the local. During the Romantic period, writers begin to believe that to be original in Latin America was necessarily to possess the ability to see anew the local, or to define one's place as local, and in that sense as different from Spain or Europe. With Romanticism, Latin American literature at last pays attention to local conditions in what is known as the Second Revolution. The Romantic period that spans from 1830 to 1860 is the moment in which, according to scholars, national literatures emerge or start being conceptualized as such. It is also the moment in which some writers call for an emancipation of the American Spanish language in an effort to distinguish it from the one used in Spain. Now, what we find in the text of the period is that as literature moves in new directions in its quest to represent the local, for example, or in its quest to create a new language, a new Spanish, there is a struggle to make sense of that newness. maybe the easier way to visualize this struggle is to point out that the same thing that was deemed original by some could be considered monstrous by others. And the critiques of Romanticism are a good example of how Latin Americans experienced this process by which the quest for the new produced monsters. Latin Americans called Romanticism modern literature, relating it to the future rather than to the past or the Middle Ages. That's something very different from the Romantic movements in Europe, for example. They basically understood it as Dumas in the prologue to Hernani, as freedom, as liberalism in literature. But most Latin American writers were dismayed at the actual Romantic productions, especially the dramas coming from Europe. The following is one of the usual critiques that they articulated against Romanticism. This is an article published by Joaquín Blesgana, a very famous Chilean writer, and this is my last quote, I think. The Romantic generation became infatuated with the rapid progress made by a literary school in Europe, a school that was reasonable and beneficial in its initial stages, for it destroyed many of the uncomfortable links imposed by ancient rules. But once it had become a sect, it protected under its name all the ridiculous and foolish whims that 1,000 sick minds could engender. So in this quote, you have a lot of keywords of the period: youth, progress, the new spirit, regeneration, but also, on the other hand, sick minds that are aborting monsters. And I think this is a great example of the conflictive relationship to the new characteristic of these writers. On the one hand, the new is celebrated because it serves to put an end to 3 centuries of darkness in the Spanish Empire, to an era of prejudice and myth, right? This is the negative dimension of the new, that which is not old. The new serves to break with something. But the new becomes monstrous as soon as it assumes a positive dimension. Or actual forms. This is the moment when the images of sick minds and sick bodies start to proliferate, and when the enthusiasm with which some writers had been referring to the need to break with the past becomes somber. Somber enthusiasm is actually a phrase that I found in more than one writer of the Romantic era, and it refers to a subjectivity that is conscious of the impossibilities to satiate a desire that is perpetual in nature. So there was one more quote, but I will skip it. Today, I will wrap up. I have sketched out the cultural shift by which the new became a dominant value in Latin American culture during the first half of the 19th century, in the context of the emergence of periodicals as a new medium, and of fashion as a pattern of cyclical renovation. And I think that these last things I've been mentioning might help us to understand one of the challenges brought up by this cultural shift, which one of the challenges that for me has been always the most intriguing aspect of this project. And that is the fact that the new could be experienced as monstrosity, and that the desire for the new could be perceived as pathological, thus suggesting early perceptions of the alienation implicit in the same modernity that is supposed to free us from the myths of the past. That's all I have. Thank you.
Victor, are you going to take questions?
Sure. If there are any questions, I think we still have a few minutes. Yes.
It's just fascinating. Thank you for this talk. Like how this changes were very much resonating with the changes in East Asia, 100 years later, 1900s. And I was just, I like this talk of this hunger for novelty and the fashion of coming on the printing and periodicals and all that. It's very much happening the same in China and Mongolia and East Asia. I was wondering, in your research,
applications in terms of
There's like
sexuality.
novels that are printed where we were kind of secretly read like among the aristocrats, but they were now printed and became popular literature, and it's both happening simultaneously in Europe and in China. So it's very liberal.
Since we don't have a microphone in this room.
I could try to wrap up the
Would you?
summarize the questions. Yeah. So far, the first question has to do with the impact or the implications of this increasing value of the new for women in particular, and also there was actually a second question on periodicals and if there were any publications related to sexuality in periodicals, and I think you were going to ask a third question.
The last question I had just about what you mentioned, like local. Would you see it as a kind of study or a revelation of indigenous traditions even there?
Yeah, and the third question is, what did the local mean for Latin Americans when they speak about it during the Romantic period? Very briefly, for the first question, it's a very important question, very broad. In a way, women were immersed in the same process of modernization, so the implications were different. But I would have to, in a way, prepare a whole new talk to really talk about that, right? Let me just say briefly that women, as I mentioned briefly, were in a way participating more in the public sphere in different ways, and that meant that they were shocking in many respects as a public spectacle, right? Sometimes because of the way they were dressed, sometimes because they were speaking about things they didn't used to speak in the past. But that's a whole other universe. Things are changing. They're changing a lot. I wish I had time to really talk about that, but it would take me in a very different direction. The second question, the short answer would be no. In the 1830s and 40s, the bestsellers in Latin America are French novels translated into Spanish in different cities of France, for example, and then sold to the Latin American market. Most of those novels were sentimental romantic novels, sentimental novels from the 18th century, but also new bestsellers by the main French writers of the time. And in that respect, they were all about love. But just the word sexuality wouldn't describe any of these publications, really, at least the ones I'm aware of in the mainstream. Third question about the local. That's a very good question. Most of the work you can do when you go back to newspapers or to any written sources of the early 19th century has to do with the productions of the elites, which were Creole and which were very Eurocentric. So, of course, there are a number of debates on how Eurocentric they were and what that implied in terms of other traditions. A couple of things very briefly. Some new republics like Argentina, they were created all of a sudden. It was a big surprise for everybody. They needed a past. They had to invent one very quickly. And they mixed Roman objects, for example, with objects from the Inca Empire, which wasn't really what Buenos Aires local cultures or aboriginal cultures were about before. So it was a big mix in which the local, if by local you mean, or the indigenous, had some role, even in Argentina, Chile, and Cuba, which are precisely the regions of Latin America where indigenous populations had less of a presence during this period compared to Peru or Mexico, where there's a very different history. And but that presence, the local usually was in the process of being invented. So in a way, it was like an empty signifier, the local. We need a local literature. And everybody claimed we need a local literature. But nobody could tell you what that would be like. Because in a way, it was a big surprise for these countries to be countries in the first place, in many cases. So to develop this sense of nationality was a long process. I'm giving a very a simplistic answer, but I think it goes to the heart of it, at least in the case of Argentina, the Chilean elites, and in the case of Cuba, which was the colony, the story is very different, but there was still a nationalist discourse developing. There was even poetry developed that was related to the indigenous groups present in Cuba that had already disappeared, really. So very different from other areas of Latin America. Sorry, it was a long answer. Any more questions? Yes.
You talked to this recently about the influence of sort of European traditions on creating a new thing. Did they look at all to North America? Did that have any role? How did they see the relationship between text and North America?
North America was important as a political example, right, of emancipation. And so up to a certain extent, yes. However, Europe, I mean, it's very slowly that Latin Americans start traveling, for example, to the US and start thinking of the US as a model. For example, I mentioned Sarmiento. He's a good example. He went to Europe and to the US in the same trip. He wanted to go to Europe. That's what he kept hearing about in Argentina. And what he found was civilization in crisis, right? This violence, this repression, these monarchies, this poverty. He was shocked. And when he came to the US, he thought he had found, the new Arcadia. He was so fascinated by the United States. So he had a big impact on a lot of other Latin American writers who started using the U.S. as a model. But that was more the second half of the 19th century, really. But of course, the Revolution of Independence was present in the minds of Latin Americans. And in the case of Cuba in particular, in the 1820s, you have a lot of Cuban exiles living in Philadelphia and New York. You even have periodicals published in Spanish in Philadelphia or New York for the local community, but also for Cubans and other Latin Americans. And those people living in the U.S., of course, generated a network of exchanges that was very rich, translating American writers and also allowing American writers to maybe consider visiting some areas of Latin America, etc., etc. Yes. Yes.
You talked about Romanticism and the Latin American adoption of some of those, Romanticism rather than European Romanticism has a really strong nostalgic element to it. So is there the same tension in Latin American Romanticism, or this tension between newness and nostalgia at the same time?
Yes, in that respect, that's a very interesting question, because in that respect, Latin American romanticisms are very, very different. There were historical novels being written. The historical novel was in itself something that became very popular after Walter Scott. In Latin America, certainly after the 1820s and the 1830s. So in those historical novels or theater plays, you have in a way this effort to consider the past. In general, it was the golden age of the Inca Empire, of the Aztecs, a past that in a way was the prelude for the autonomous nations of Latin America. But that's in a way the exception. When you think of Romanticism in Latin America, what you find is people excited about breaking with the rules of neoclassicism. And they use Romanticism as a liberation tool. It's understood as a movement of freedom in which artists shouldn't be restricted to work in a certain way. They should work in whatever way they want. And the local is very important. But the local is not nostalgic, or is nostalgic in a very problematic way in these nations, because I mentioned before, yes, they were talking about the Inca Empire. Well, if you go to Peru, for example, or Bolivia, they were thinking about that, but they had actual like indigenous people living with them. I mean, the current president of Bolivia is indigenous, Evo Morales, so you see that presence. But these elites who were writing plays about the Inca past, it didn't cross their minds to consider that the actual living indigenous populations could have any say on that reconstruction of the past, right? So is that nostalgia? In a way, it's a totally, it's a total manipulation of the past with overtones of nostalgia, if you want, like, oh, we were so happy before the Spanish conquered us. We. But the we is very problematic. Who is articulating the we, right? And so what's, I think for me, the most interesting when you compare Latin American Romanticism and European Romanticism is this great importance of the future. It's all about the future. Everything has to imply moving towards the future. Whereas romantic movements in Europe are really about like, oh, we were better off in the past. So, right? I mean, maybe this is, of course, a generalization. And if you go to other places like Greece, you might have different articulations of these. But anyway, that would be the short answer. Any more questions? Marilyn?
What percentage of the population was actually reading this literature? How much was there at that point in time?
Yeah, the periodicals that I have mentioned, you mean?
Yes, the periodicals and
Yes, very little. It's to give you some figures. Around 1810, only 10% of the population could read and write. 1850, around 15% of the population. But not all of those people really read and write. And actually, for these publications, at the beginning of the 19th century, they have very few subscribers. They were based on subscription, so many times they waited to get some money from the subscribers to be able to pay for the publication. And they had maybe 100 if they were lucky. And those 100 people were the most important people, in a way, of the city, right? And they might have subscribers somewhere else. So they were the big families. And many of them subscribed because they were really interested in reading them. Many of them subscribed because it would look bad not to be subscribed, right? And that's why they published their list of subscribers regularly to see who was there and who was not. So as you move forward in time, in Cuba already in the 1830s, you have periodicals being read that are issuing 2,000 copies. Cuba has a bigger economy, it develops earlier, and by the 1850s, you have very modern presses and periodicals publishing maybe 5,000, 6,000 issues a day. That's the exception, though. Maybe in the 1840s in Buenos Aires or in Chile, you still have 400 subscribers if you're very lucky. So we're talking about very small numbers, but in a way, these were small, I mean, the lettered city, in a way, the people who participated in literary culture was very reduced, too. So, yes?
Is there an historical imperative there too? Is what's happening, like it's interesting that the periodical starting in the first decade of the 19th century, is what's happening here that the British blockade is keeping literature out of the colonies because now Spain and France are blocked up. And so these journals are starting to fill a gap which has appeared now that they can't get Spanish journals. Is that what's happening?
That's an interesting question. It works in different ways. What happens at first is that all of a sudden Latin America is open to international book trade or print trade in general. So before it was all coming from Spain, all of a sudden you can get stuff from other parts of the world. Then you have the case of Cuba, in which many things could be published in the US and brought clandestinely into Cuba. Cuba was still a colony. but your question, if I understand it correctly, was about periodicals being printed locally as a way to provide the population with.
I'm just thinking if you've got a colonial population which is getting its literature probably from the mother country, and then all of a sudden that's completely stopped because you've got the British blockade which allows nothing out of that anymore. Nothing comes out of it.
Yeah.
Anything comes out, it's taken.
Yeah.
So, and that's a big argument for, the development of nationalism in Latin America too.
Mhm.
That's because it also, the literature's being cut off. And
Yeah.
so suddenly you have a vacuum,
Yeah.
which local
Yeah.
exploit.
Yeah, and your question, in a way, is difficult for me to answer because the way they experienced this was they had been finally liberated from Spain, so they could finally get stuff from other places as well. They were still getting things from Spain. I mean, they were Spanish publishers that in a way tried to export to Latin America. And periodicals, I mean, bringing a periodical usually meant someone putting in on the ship and traveling. There were no postal like services getting for regular correspondence in the first decades of the century. So in a way, the big effort was to, in a way, move away from that Spanish tradition and incorporate other traditions as a way to precisely leave that behind. So yes, there was a new engagement with new imperial powers, imperial centers such as England and France, as a way to move in a new direction in terms of reading and publications. Yeah. I don't know if maybe we don't have more time, right, Travis? For like.
I think we have to wrap it up, actually.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.